It's the spring of 1944. You're standing at your kitchen table with two things in front of you: a ration book with more empty squares than full ones, and a newspaper ad with Mickey Mouse on it, telling you to plant a garden. You've done this before. Last year, you grew a few rows of beans and called it patriotism. This year, the government isn't asking anymore. It's putting a number on the table: $1.2 billion. That's what they claim American families saved by growing their own food instead of buying it. Before you get impressed by that figure, sit with this. Nobody I can find ever nailed down where it actually comes from. Not a wartime ledger, not a government report with a line item. It shows up the way a lot of big round numbers show up, repeated so often it starts to sound official. So we're going to treat it the way you'd treat any number a stranger hands you with total confidence. Interesting, unproven, worth investigating. Here's what we can prove instead. 1944 was the single biggest year Victory Gardens ever had. And it was also the year the government's own target quietly failed. Nearly 19 million families planted a garden that year. The government wanted closer to 21 million. That gap, sitting right in the middle of the program's best year, tells you more about how this system actually worked than any billion-dollar headline does. If this is your first stop on this topic, here's the piece most people skip. The Victory Garden wasn't one idea. It was 5, stapled together under one friendly name: grow more fresh produce, preserve the surplus, save families money, get city dwellers access to land they didn't own, and keep morale up on a home front that was, frankly, getting tired. That's not a gardening campaign. That's a household economics program that happened to use a shovel as its delivery method. Every fact in the next 18 minutes traces back to one of those 5 goals. And by the end, you'll see why the money angle, the one nobody markets correctly, was actually the goal doing the most work. Here's where the official story starts showing cracks. The national target for 1944 was somewhere around 21 million gardens. Some later summaries pushed that number even higher, to 22 million. What actually got reported back to Washington was closer to 19.6 million. And depending on which federal count you trust, the number that gets repeated most often today is 18.5 million, which was also in that same year credited with producing roughly 40% of the country's fresh vegetables. Read those two numbers side by side and something strange happens. The program is simultaneously the biggest success of the entire war. 40% of a nation's fresh produce, from backyard plots and vacant lots, and a target that came up short by a couple million households. Success and shortfall in the same year from the same program. That's not a contradiction you'll find in the cheerful version of this story, because the cheerful version only has room for one number. The real version has room for both. And the tension between them is exactly why this topic is worth another look in 1944 instead of stopping at 1943. National figures are useful for headlines. They're terrible for understanding what actually happened in someone's yard. For that, you need to go smaller. And North Dakota's own wartime reporting is about as granular as this story gets. By that state's count, 98% of farms and just over 90% of village and city homes had what officials called an adequate garden in 1944. The average size of one of those gardens, roughly 7,500 square feet. Sit with that for a second, because it demolishes the mental image most people carry into this topic. A few tomato plants by the back fence. 7,500 square feet is closer to 1/6 of an acre. That's not a hobby plot. That's a working piece of land. Officials even ran the yield math down to a formula: a 1/4 pound of produce per square foot, expected on average across the season. Multiply that out across a garden that size, and you're looking at close to a ton of food from one household's yard. And the state didn't stop at pounds. It went straight to dollars. North Dakota valued its 1944 harvest at just over $4 million, using a rate of $30 a ton. That's the part almost nobody quotes, because it's less dramatic than $1.2 billion and far more defensible. A real number from a real state report. that you can actually trace back to its source. Here's the mechanism underneath everything in this video, and it's not what most people assume when they hear family money strategy. Nobody handed a housewife a check for growing tomatoes. There was no envelope of cash arriving because a garden did well. The savings worked through substitution. Every vegetable that came out of your own dirt was a vegetable you didn't have to buy, didn't have to hand a ration coupon over for, and didn't have to find shelf space for in a store that was running short anyway. Canned vegetables, specifically, were rationed, so a jar of your own tomatoes wasn't just food. It was a coupon you got to keep, to spend somewhere else, on meat, on sugar, on whatever your family was actually short on that month. That's the real hidden money strategy, and it's a sharper idea than a headline figure, because it explains behavior instead of just citing a total. Families weren't chasing a lump sum. They were quietly rerouting a household budget around a rationing system that had frozen half of it in place. The garden was the only lever left that the government hadn't already capped, counted, or coupon restricted, so that's where families pushed, and the growth kept going even as the war dragged into its third and fourth year, which tells you this wasn't a one-season burst of enthusiasm. Seed sales in 1944 were reported up 15% over the year before. Garden output was reported up another 10% on top of that. A tired population, deep into a long war, was still expanding a program most modern viewers assume peaked and folded well before 1944. This is the second video in a series on the hidden economics most people never connect to their own history. If digging past the headline number is your kind of thing, subscribe. There's a lot more ledger underneath the surface. Let's keep going. Getting a household to reroute its own budget for the better part of 4 years takes more than a poster on a wall. It takes a marketing operation, and by 1944, the Victory Garden program was running one that would look familiar to anyone who studied modern celebrity endorsement. Mickey Mouse was on the posters. So was Batman. So was Superman. Vice President Henry Wallace lent his name to the campaign, and so did Eleanor Roosevelt, a sitting first lady standing next to a cartoon mouse, both selling the same shovel. That's not a wholesome home front detail. That's a coordinated multimedia campaign, running characters owned by different studios and a sitting administration through the same messaging, years before brand partnership was a phrase anyone used. The goal wasn't just morale in the abstract. It was retention. A 4-year program needs a reason for a tired household to keep showing up in year 4 the same way it did in year 1. And a Batman poster does something a government pamphlet alone never could. It turns a chore into an identity a kid and then a household wants to be part of. Here's a detail that undercuts the simple, wholesome backyard image more than almost anything else in this story. The pesticide the country relied on to protect these gardens was, for most of American history, imported from Japan. Pyrethrum, a natural insecticide derived from a chrysanthemum, was the standard tool against garden pests before the war. Once the country you're fighting is also your main supplier of the chemical protecting your food supply, that arrangement stops working, immediately and completely. The wartime shortage that followed is a big part of why DDT moved from an experimental compound into mainstream civilian use faster than it otherwise would have. Your grandmother's garden wasn't just shaped by rationing and propaganda. It was shaped by a broken global supply chain for bug spray. And the home food system didn't stop at plants. Plenty of Victory gardeners kept chickens alongside their rows of vegetables, not as a separate hobby, but as part of the same operation. Eggs, meat, and, less obviously, pest control, since chickens will happily eat the insects a shortage of pyrethrum left unchecked. The backyard wasn't a garden. It was a small improvised farm, running on whatever inputs the war economy hadn't already claimed. Growing the food was, by the government's own framing, only half the job. The other half was keeping it edible until winter. And that half is where most of the real labor and the real household economics actually lived. This is where the substitution ledger from earlier compounds. A vegetable eaten in July offsets one purchase. The same vegetable, canned and eaten in January, offsets a purchase during the exact stretch of the year when ration books were thinnest and grocery shelves were least reliable. Preservation wasn't a side chore attached to gardening. It was the mechanism that let a single summer's harvest offset an entire winter's shortages, instead of just a few weeks of them. That's also why the government's instructional material spent as much time on canning, storage, and spoilage prevention as it did on planting schedules. An 18 million household program only works if 18 million households also know how to keep produce from rotting in a cellar by November. Growing the food was the easy half. Keeping it was the half that actually made the money-saving math hold up across an entire year instead of a single season. Now, for the part of this story that breaks the patriotic home front image completely. The same Victory Garden program, the one with Mickey Mouse on the poster and Eleanor Roosevelt's name on the campaign, was also operating inside Japanese-American incarceration camps, assembly centers, war relocation centers, Department of Justice camps. People who had lost their homes, their businesses, and their freedom were growing gardens under the exact same national banner used to sell the program to everyone outside the fence. And what they grew wasn't random. Residents planted traditional Japanese vegetables and ornamental plants, and at some sites arranged their gardens using shakai, a landscaping approach that borrows the distant scenery beyond a garden's edge into its design. Inside a camp ringed by guard towers, the one piece of borrowed scenery available was a desert horizon nobody could fence off. Some of these gardeners planted rows knowing full well they might be transferred to another camp before anything they'd grown was ready to eat. The archaeology backs up just how little these gardeners had to work with. At Amache, researchers have recovered homemade wheelbarrow parts, planter pots built from repurposed tin cans, and watering tools made from cans someone had punched full of holes by hand. None of it store-bought. All of it engineered from scraps by people the government had already decided didn't deserve the freedom the garden posters were selling to everyone else. That's the real center of gravity for this entire topic. Not the $1.2 billion, not the seed sale percentages. This, a government running the same household economics machine on people it had simultaneously stripped of their rights, and the machine not caring. Because scarcity math doesn't check your citizenship status before it runs the numbers. So, was there really a $1.2 billion hidden family money strategy? The honest answer is something like it existed, but not as a check anyone cashed. It existed as a substitution. As millions of households quietly rerouting grocery money away from rationed, coupon-controlled vegetables and toward whatever else they were short on, one backyard harvest at a time. The real strategy wasn't planting, it was reallocation. A garden that size, multiplied across nearly 19 million households in the program's peak year, wasn't a symbol of self-reliance so much as a distributed budget relief system. One running on chickens and canning jars and borrowed insecticide substitutes as much as it ran on seed packets. And it ran everywhere at once. In a state report from North Dakota that put a real dollar figure on a real harvest. In a cartoon mouse's face on a war poster. In a desert camp where the same government running the campaign had taken away everything except the dirt and the horizon. Different settings, same underlying machine. Because a system built to manage scarcity doesn't ask who deserves the relief before it starts running. Here's the question worth sitting with. If a government could get 19 million households to voluntarily rewrote their own grocery budgets for 4 straight years, using nothing but posters, cartoon characters, and a genuine shortage, what would it actually take to get that kind of participation today? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want the next installment in this series, the parts of history that never make it past the headline number, subscribe. There's more ledger to go through.